Just one of the flashpoints in this part of the world blazing red. Iran and Pakistan now trading fire. And with the war in Gaza raging, tensions between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon grow, while militants attack U.S. forces in Syria and Iraq.
You know things are bad in the region when even the Taliban are calling for calm.
Should we be worried about this rising tension in the Middle East?
I think the world's going mad. So, what started out as a conflict in Gaza, we're now getting more and more towards the border of India.
Well, rebels are rising in the Middle East once again for the fourth time. The U.S. carrying out retaliatory strikes against the Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen. The Houthis again preparing to fire missiles toward the commercial ships in the Red Sea.
That's a critical trade route for the world, so the U.S. has taken preemptive action, once again launching Tomahawk missiles against those Houthi rebels. And there's also more escalation in the region. Pakistan is now striking Iran.
Really what this is seeing Iran flexing its military muscles around the ongoing Middle Eastern crisis. And this is just yet again Iran trying to show that it is a regional power. And also ultimately what we can say simply is that this crisis continues to just grow here in the Middle East.
And they are the center of gravity that's destabilizing the region. They have 7 proxies out there working their agenda. The most significant one, obviously, is the war in Gaza, but we've noted all the others, and you just mentioned another one, the Houthis. Where is all that coming from? That is because Iran's objectives are very clear, and that is to dominate and control the Middle East, drive the United States military out of the Middle East, and destroy the state of Israel by weakening it politically, and people don't want to live there. So this is what is happening here.
We are seeing a very dangerous back and forth unfolding between two nuclear states.
Well, what you have to realize that Pakistan's attack on Iran is unprecedented. I can't remember this ever occurred, especially a missile strike against an Iranian village.
And that's because earlier this week, an Iranian strike targeted what Tehran claims was a Sunni militant base in this area of Pakistan. That's in addition to airstrikes that the regime launched late Monday in Iraq and Syria, also a response to the terror attack in Kerman, which has now been claimed by the Islamic State. All of this is part of a wider explosion of violence across the region. Houthi rebels have been attacking commercial vessels in the Red Sea since November last year. They say as an act of solidarity with the Palestinians and to pressure Israel into a ceasefire in Gaza.
It's not just the Houthis who are disrupting commerce or making attacks and kinetic elements right there in the Red Sea. We're also seeing 100+ attacks that are occurring in Iraq and also in Syria, which is another element of an Iranian-backed militia, the Kataib Hezbollah.
You mentioned the Houthi terror designation and that it was just reinstated to a certain extent.
The Biden administration has designated your group, the Houthis, as a terrorist organization. What is your reaction to that?
We would say to Biden, this label should be given to Netanyahu, he says.
Is there now a regional war underway between the United States and Iranian-backed groups, including your own?
Yes, as we said, America announced the war against us, he says.
But following last week's U.S.-UK bombardment, those threats turned to action again. The U.S. military says fighter jets struck 4 anti-ship ballistic missiles preparing to launch from Houthi territory in Yemen. Barely 24 hours after an attack on a U.S.-operated cargo ship, a Greek-owned ship was struck today by a Houthi missile in the Red Sea. Near the coast of Somalia, the U.S. military released these new images: Iranian-supplied warheads and missile parts confiscated from this ship headed to Houthi militants in Yemen.
But it's not just the Houthis and the Red Sea. War is spreading across the Middle East, with the U.S. at the center of it. The United States is now in an increasingly open and expanding conflict with what is known as the Axis of Resistance, a network of militant groups in 6 countries and territories. All are backed by Iran.
2 weeks ago, in an Iranian city called Kerman, the Islamic State group carried out the biggest bomb attack in Iran in decades, and Iran retaliated with strikes in Syria aimed at what it claimed were Islamic State positions. There were also missile strikes in Iraq, targeting what Iran claimed was an Israeli spy base, Iran also claims that Israel and the US were, in part, responsible for the Kerman attack. Iran's provided no evidence for either allegation. Iran is relevant to other escalations in Iraq too. In recent weeks, there's been an increase in attacks by Shia militias on US forces in Iraq. Those militias are backed by Iran. Then this week, another layer of complexity was added.
NATO is calling up almost 100,000 troops for its biggest drills in almost 40 years.
As the war between Russia and Ukraine rages on, NATO is stepping in to remind Moscow of its military capabilities. The alliance launching what it calls Operation Steadfast Defender 24, its biggest series of joint exercises since the Cold War. The goal, rehearsing how American troops would reinforce European allies in countries bordering Russia if the conflict in Ukraine expands. They'll be deployed along an eastern front stretching thousands of miles. NATO is hoping it's enough to deter Russia from targeting a member nation. And officials say drills like these wouldn't have been possible a few years ago, but Moscow's invasion of Ukraine united the alliance against a common adversary.
That is a record number of troops that we can bring to bear and have an exercise with in that size. Across the alliance, across the ocean.
The Russians pushing back strongly, condemning the new exercises and promising a, quote, appropriate reaction.
The increased activity of NATO near the borders of Russia is provocative in nature and leads to the complete degradation of the European security architecture.
Hi, Kira. Yes, some pretty significant comments from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in a speech tonight where he ruled out the creation of a Palestinian state after the war, directly contradicting U.S. policy, because this comes at a moment when the U.S. and key Arab states have basically been pushing what could almost be seen as the outline of a possible peace plan, which would see Saudi Arabia normalize relations with Israel in exchange for concrete steps towards a Palestinian state. And just over the last 2 days, we've seen U.S. officials, senior U.S. officials, pushing this and saying that it's a historic opportunity for Israel to try and put an end, finally, to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But Prime Minister Netanyahu tonight making it clear he does not want to take that opportunity, saying that Israel must have control over all of the territory from west of the River Jordan, making a Palestinian state impossible. And so this is obviously going to become a major problem for the Biden administration, where there is clearly a huge divide between what the Israeli government currently wants after this war and what the U.S. government wants.
Right. Since 1948, the United States' position has been there should be a Jewish state where the United Nations drew the lines and an Arab-Palestinian state in the rest of that territory. And this is just thumbing the nose, not just at the world in general, but at the United States.
But I think what we've learned since October 7th is that the entire regional stability of the Middle East depends in large part on what's happening in Israel and Palestine.
It looks like this is going to continue to escalate day by day. No one can predict how fast, but it is going to escalate.
But you're talking specifically there, I suppose, about the region. What about the rest of the world?
Well, the United States is going to be drawn into it. And so is Australia, by the way. If shipping routes to Europe are closed down and through the Red Sea, and this is not to mention some sort of fighting in the Gulf, which is possible. And as we've talked about before, this will affect oil prices considerably.
The US seems to have been okay up until this point with us not sending assets, military assets and hardware in. Do you think that might get a bit funky?
Well, if I were Australia, I wouldn't get into a war in Yemen. I mean, like we've talked about, I've trained these people. You don't. It's been a horrible war. The Saudis have been fighting the Houthis for almost a decade, and they made no headway, and I doubt we will either. But it's hard to predict if this really spreads across the Middle East, which looks like it will.